What a joy it is to welcome you to this WebinART featuring the most recent exhibition of the art of Brother Thomas, which we just opened at the gallery, entitled Continuing Presence. Indeed, Brother Thomas is ever present, not only in our lives, but in the lives of 76 Boston artists who have received Brother Thomas fellowships. Each of these fellowships comes with a stipend of $15,000 with no strings attached on how the artist uses the money. Over the years, we have documented many of these artists and how they have applied these funds to move their art ahead. Please reach out to the gallery to learn more, as we would be happy to share the tales and their tales with you. Thomas's desire to help struggling artists, regardless of their age and not limited to any particular criteria or medium, has allowed the Boston Foundation to identify and support the wide and diverse talents of Boston artists. In fact, there are now 76 of these artists in our community. What a privilege it has been to be involved with honoring Thomas's wish and now his legacy. A total of over $1 million has gone and been shared in these past 11 years. Many of you may know that he and I corresponded daily by fax for 23 years. Over those years, we saved 19 boxes of handwritten faxes, missives which we have revisited to cull quotes for various publications and to guide our daily lives. We've now published 4 daybooks with 52 quotes each, and we are now preparing a 5th. Let me share a couple of his thoughts, after which I will invite Geoff Dunn to share in sharing tales of Thomas with you and with me. These and other quotes will frame our conversation today. Thomas wrote, "We all share a creative goal with art. The goal is difficult. It is an invitation to change the world." He also wrote, "We are all born with creativity because we are born with an unquenchable thirst for the beautiful." Art is not an occupation. At some point, it becomes a state of being, becoming something from which we can never retire, an interior bush that never burns out. And finally, and most relevant to our upcoming exchange, memory is more permanent than matter. What a great joy it is to welcome Geoff Dunn. Let me ask Geoff to introduce himself and his unique friendship with Brother Thomas. Geoff?
Hi, and thank you for the privilege and the honor of this invitation. I am a retired trauma surgeon who had a second medical career working in palliative medicine, particularly as it applied to surgical situations. That's relevant with respect to Thomas because he was very much a part of that transition and the work that I did do in that field. Thomas and I met very much by chance, but certainly it was Beshert. At the time, my son Harrison was taking piano lessons at the Benedictine monastery where Thomas was affiliated. And during these long lessons, I would go up to the library to seek some sleep after a difficult night on call. And there was a long sofa there. And on one end, every time I went up there, there was this disheveled looking fellow peacefully asleep, who I thought was a homeless person that the charitable monastery had taken under its protection. And I would sleep in the other end of the sofa. And this went on for a couple of weeks. And we would politely nod to each other. And after a few weeks, just spontaneously, we both reached our hand out at the same time. We very quickly found out we had quite an overlap of interests and ideas about things. And he very quickly became part of my family here in Erie, coming to my home for holidays such as Thanksgiving and Easter. He was sort of a deputized auxiliary grandfather to my son Harrison, and it was extremely generous and kind in that way with his time. He also became very close to my father, who also was a surgeon, and described Thomas as a role model for him, which was interesting because he died at the age of 99, but was never bereft of a role model. But Thomas said the same thing about my father, who himself was quite a mensch in war and in peace. So that was the personal connection. The substance of our relationship occurred over many years with at times almost daily visits that I made to his studio over on 10th and Parade Street. It was a pretty quick jaunt from the hospital, my bicycle, and I would come late morning. That seemed to be the time that worked best for him. Often when I'd be there, I'd hear the busy fax machine in the background, and Thomas would roll his eyes, usually because he was behind some task that Bernie was waiting for. Monks never complain. They just moan. They don't complain. But after that, the conversation usually started with the sort of just the immediate problems of the day. And then as time went on, they would transition to more philosophical reflection and more personal reflection. These sessions usually lasted about an hour or so. Invariably, he would have a very civil, very carefully laid out tea service, of course, with his own creations serving it. And as you would enter the space where he worked, you really had the sense you were in on hallowed ground, in a sacred space. The anteroom to his studio was a very small gallery where he had exhibited artworks that were given to him in trade for some of his work. One of the biggest boosts that I ever had to my own fledgling career was the day he had asked for one of my pieces to be out there. And the artwork out there, in the gallery, he treated with great reverence. During the season of Lent, he would drape all the pieces in his art gallery to be uncovered at the time of Easter, which was was a huge amount of respect and reverence that he showed for other people's creations. Then after passing through the gallery, you would step into this enormous labyrinth with this giant kiln that had written on it, had a notation affixed to it that said the womb of God. And this clearly was sort of the sacrificial altar. And all about the room, you would see evidence of his work, thousands of jars of glazes and different chemicals that went into glazes. I didn't really see him work very often because I had the sense that Thomas at the wheel was Thomas at prayer. And I think he appreciated that sense of respect for his space. He only saw me in scrubs one time, and that was when he himself was a patient in the OR. So and I had the same feeling about my own work. And this is where we really overlap, because we both believe that our calling was not only a craft, but it was an art as well. That ultimately it was prayer. We weren't doing surgery. We weren't doing art. Each in our own way, we were doing our belief, our own theologies.
I love the notion of holy space. As you may or may not know, over the years, when we've done exhibitions in the gallery, I've often put up a sign that says, silence or quiet, please, you're in a holy space. And I must say that the present installation of Thomas's works alongside those of Paul Caponegro create a sense of the beautiful, the holy, the quiet, the almost silent. It's an invitation simply to move into yourself and use the art as a means of finding your way there. It's an incredible gift that you gave to Thomas, and certainly he gave to you. There's just no way to in any way think about it other than that. And the nice thing about his sense of holy space was that it was inhabited by whatever each of us brought to it,
Mhm.
so that there was no specific requirement that there be either a 3 or 4 letter word present, whether it's God or the Lord, but rather self and the capacity within each one of us to engage with ourselves with questions that Thomas raised, but very gently, about what is beautiful, what is kind, and so forth. And so that's an enormous gift in the world that we're living in. What I suggested, Jeff, along the way was that we might use a quote of Thomas's and then on the screen have one of the works that are in the show and just exchange tales of Thomas. So the first quote is, "We are all born with creativity because we are born with an unquenchable thirst for the beautiful." And the first book that we published of Thomas's was called The Path to the Beautiful. And often people mistake that for a superficial external beauty. But I think that Thomas's unquenchable thirst that he's referring to for the beautiful is an inner beauty, a sense of wholeness, a sense of calm, and a sense of what we talked about before, holiness. So the piece that we're going to look at is on the cover of the catalog. And I must say that each of the shows that we've done of Thomas's have their own titles. But this one particularly, called Continuing Presence, with this work on the cover, makes it perfectly clear that there is, at least in the case of Thomas, or Brother Thomas, a very viable and vital afterlife. Jeff, your thoughts?
Well, I was struck how metaphorical Potts were in just the way he was spiritually, because all his pots, all the vessels they found their use, they found their application in their emptying. And this was a constant source of spiritual nutrition, the constant giving of the pot or of the chalice or of the tea bowl. It was meant to be empty. And I saw this in his creative cycle as well. Prior to the firing, which was really sort of the ultimate, in many ways, sort of the sacrificial act. He was going to the altar that would consume the sacrifice with fire. He would be busily preparing for the firing, and he had very intricate, very careful, almost like a mechanical engineer's drawings of the spatial relationships of all the pots. And those relationships were critical in terms of how the glazes achieve their oxidation or their reduction potentials, because we used to chit chat a little bit about chemistry. And because these relationships were so delicate and carefully balanced, any mishap that could occur, any wobble could result in a complete catastrophe in destruction of everything that went into that kiln. So the time before he actually shut the door and the gas went on was one of great apprehension, sometimes even foreboding, when he knew the alignment might be particularly precarious or the contents particularly valuable or meaningful to somebody. Once it was opened, there was almost a palpable sense of relief, because fortunately the issue was usually sound and healthy. I always related this to what my wife, who was an obstetrician, with the delivery of a baby, which is why I like so much his characterization of the kiln as the womb of God, because I was hearing about wombs every day and participated in those exercises with my wife in some cases. After that time, there would come a period where he was really emptied out. The pot or the chalice was emptied. It was almost like a clinical depression, but not quite the same thing, because there wasn't complete anhedonia. He didn't lose his capacity to enjoy things, but he was definitely subdued. But I knew that this was a critical antecedent for whatever the next round, whether it was a series of eggs or whatever it was going to be, for that to take place. It was like a field that's fallow just before the spring planting.
Whenever Thomas fired, he referred to the firing as the only act that an artist takes where he gives over the completion of the work to another force. So the fire played an enormous role in this. And the documentary that we did in 1991 is called Gifts from the Fire. So when he opened that door, there were gifts there, but there were also innumerable pieces, almost 90% of everything that he created. They also went under the hammer, so to speak. He broke those pieces because they didn't speak to him. It was not what people interpret as he was a perfectionist. If anything, he was looking to perfect himself as a human being, and they had to resonate with that journey. So it's always important to keep that in mind, that the journey itself was so critical to him, and both the making, the firing, and the breaking of the pots, and then the recognition of those that would survive and represent him in the world as his children in many ways.
Much of his
part of that
genius,
journey. Pardon me?
I thought much of his genius as an artist was his acceptance and use of uncertainty, that it played such a critical role. He wasn't over controlling and trying to predetermine and guarantee an exact outcome at all. He welcomed the uncertainty, and he would have been the first to tell you the unexpected result was usually the greatest of his work.
We would normally get about 100 pieces in every 2 years from Thomas. And he would do a very meticulous list. We have some of them, listing number 1, 2, 3, down to 100, describing the shape, the glaze, the measurements, and then maybe 3 of them had stars next to them. The other 97 were okay, but those 3 even astonished him when he opened the kiln door. So there was an ongoing process for him. What comes to mind particularly is when our son was courting his wife, now of 32 years, and she was making a film in Pittsburgh, and to impress her, I think, he said, let's go to Erie, I know this artist. So they visited Brother Thomas in his studio, and he was in the hammering mode of pieces that he had finished. And there was a very large black shaped vase. And as he was about to hammer it, our daughter-in-law now, Gigi, sort of jumped in front of him and said, Thomas, this is so beautiful, please don't. So he relented and said, I'll wait till tomorrow. And if I feel the same way, I'll break it. So apparently he waited till the next day and he didn't break it. The piece eventually came to Boston. And when Jonathan Fairbanks, the curator of decorative arts at the Museum of Fine Arts, was selecting a work for their collection in honor of his 25 years at the museum, I believe, that's the piece he chose. So that piece is now in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, having escaped the hammer, so to speak.
This hammering stuff is for real. There are 55-gallon drums full of and one time I interceded on behalf of one. I said, if you're going to swing that thing, you're going to have to hit me first. I said, this isn't just a plate. This is a Homeric shield. And I think that kind of caught his curiosity, because he certainly was a scholar of Aristotle and Homer and Hesiod. And I think that gave just enough wiggle room that he showed some restraint on that occasion. And I believe the ultimate destiny of that piece was something substantial. I don't know where it wound up, but I do know I saved it from the hammer.
Thank you very much. The next quote I just wanted to share, I think, is perfect in terms of our friendships with him. It takes a good spirit to sympathize with a friend's failures. It takes a Holy Spirit to rejoice in a friend's successes. And I think you certainly experienced his wisdom, his support, his friendship in such a profound way, especially as you found your own path from surgery to hospice to palliative care, and really broke ground for many others who've come after you in that field.
Well, he was so much a part of that. About 1994, I transitioned from being a full-time trauma surgeon to taking a time out, sensing burnout was incipient, and had a chance to work part-time as a medical director of a hospice because it was much less demanding in terms of time, more flexible. But immediately I realized this was a whole new world that seemed to have so many valuable things that were absent in the so-called medical system. And after a couple of years of experience of that, it was obvious to me that much of the framework and the principles and practices were absolutely applicable to the practice in the field of surgery. But none of this was anywhere to be found anywhere in the surgical landscape. And at that time, the field of palliative medicine was just beginning in some of the other specialties. So I decided I'd take on the world of surgery with my dear friend, Bob Milch, who had a similar transition. He was nearby in Buffalo, and I believe met Thomas one time and was equally inspired by him. My career got really underway, and I started to write for surgical publications and books. And Thomas was very much a part of that. I would have Thomas read most of the manuscripts just to get a sense that was there a spiritual center of gravity to the work? Because I thought that was probably the most important criteria for this really having a significant impact in the long run, long beyond, any specific scientific concerns or issues or clinical issues. And but there was a lot of pushback. The field of surgery wasn't quite ready for all this, and in some cases, I think felt threatened by the concept that we weren't omnipotent, we did fail, and death was not an enemy, but a natural part of the life cycle for which we were woefully unprepared to serve our patients. And I could not have had a better companion and reassuring friend than Thomas say, you're absolutely on the right path. And then when success did come, it certainly was a celebratory time with Thomas.
He was able to do that in so many ways. I know in all of the exchanges of faxes, if one of our sons did something in terms of academics, in terms of sports, in terms of professional career, Thomas was there to celebrate their success, but also to be present when things didn't work out. And his wisdom certainly informed, supported, engaged so much of what the gallery has been about these 54 years. If ever there was an opportunity to write a guide to a gallery, I think chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 would be make sure you have Brother Thomas as your friend, because his wisdom enabled the gallery and enabled me and Sue and all of us who've worked here over the years to accept, to enjoy, to appreciate, and also to be able to deal with both success and failure. And it happens all the time. Certainly, he controlled what he considered to be his failures by breaking pieces, but life itself brought many, many losses for him as well. And he was able to not only process it, but to use it and create a source of wisdom for all of us. This particular piece, and then the ones we'll look at in a minute, relate very strongly to what this exhibition is about. Dear friend and collector of photographs and art, per se, in general, Dr. Carl Herbert, otherwise known as Rusty, curated the photography of the works of Paul Caponegro. And in the next slide, you'll see the canteen that we're looking at now, presented with 4 photographs. It's a little hard in terms of the size and scale of what we're looking at, but the goal with the photographs was to really find those that have strong abstract parts to them. And in doing that, he enabled Thomas's abstractions of the glaze formulations, the pouring of the glaze, the spraying of the glaze, to really come to life in a way that in no other show that we ever did was that possible. So the juxtaposition of the way that the landscape is formed in this particular canteen piece and those pieces on the wall around it certainly made this an extraordinary opportunity. And in a way helps me move to the next quote, which is that there are two signs of a great soul: generosity and gratitude. And Thomas certainly was a representative of both of those attributes. He was generous with his wisdom, obviously, generous with his work, but he also consistently expressed gratitude to each and every one of us, who was both a friend, a colleague, artist whose works he admired. The notion of being able to genuinely say, that's wonderful, I appreciate what you have done, and know that it came from Thomas, who didn't waste words. Everything was a considered response, was a real gift. Jeff, I'm sure you experienced that any number of times with him.
Yeah.
And in turn, he was nourished by your generosity.
On so many levels, whether it was his time, his ideas, he was wonderful company. For example, when he would be here for Thanksgiving dinner, anyone he was talking to or with, they felt like they were the center of the world. And he didn't really have to say a whole lot because he was such an active listener. It seemed like he was talking in a way that he was validating or affirming whether it was a 7 or 8 year old boy's interest in a work of art or a more intellectual discussion with an adult. He was generous with fun. We used to go to movies together occasionally because I think I was his only male companion here in Erie. So it was probably at times probably a respite from the monastery where they were all women. We went to Gladiator together, and if anyone thinks he was a prude, they're all wrong. I mean, he was very modest, certainly, but not at all prude, not pious. You had a sense that his spiritual sensibilities were much more profound and elevated than simple piety, whether it was just an everyday occurrence or something more focused on, such as a holy day.
It reminds me of a wonderful tale. In the year 2000, we took a trip through the gallery to Japan. And when we returned, Thomas went on that trip with us. It was really quite extraordinary to have his eyes. And also he had an exhibit of his art in Tokyo. And since Japan is one of the sort of hallowed places for ceramics, it was a very important occasion. And it was made possible by the living national treasure artist Tatsuzo Shimaoka, whose works we do and had represented. And Shimaoka helped me find the location, the gallery for it, using his good name as an introduction. When we came with our group to the opening of the exhibition, Shimaoka was the first one there and bought one of Thomas's pieces. He was the first purchaser as well. But that aside, when we returned from the trip, Thomas came to our house and we were driving up the driveway, and in the garage, there was a convertible that our 3 sons had generously bought for my birthday, which was a spectacular surprise. And so soon after we were there, Thomas and I got in the convertible with the top down and we're driving around. And to simply reinforce what you were saying, he turned to me and he said, "Bernie, is this what they mean by a chick magnet?" So he was certainly with the jargon, but he was just delighted to be part of the experience, and yet would go back for 2 years into the isolation, into the silence of the work itself. And it's only out of the work itself is the work born. And he said that over and over again. We put these two images up on the screen simply to invite you into the quality of the pattern, the abstract pattern that was created on it. And I'm simply stunned by the beauty, the balance, the form, the grace of the piece, now that it's in this particular exhibition and the way it's shown. So there's a real invitation for any of you that can to either visit the exhibition or to see the virtual tour of the show that is available through the website. The next quote clearly is part of Thomas's understanding and teaching. What is old and beautiful is always new, and what is beautiful and new is always old. Each and every one of his pieces, I think, both tipped his hat to tradition, but also was intended as a contemporary personal statement. And the next plate is one of those just magnificent pieces of the combination of a plate, which is a plate. All of his plates were all thrown on a wheel and shaped and formed. And then when he was ready, maybe it could have stayed on the shelf for months or years, he would glaze it. And so this piece just simply in the installation as well sings adjacent to the photographs.
I remember there were so many pieces like that in his studio, and I always wonder and I remember he laughed when I said, I'm just trying to imagine what this is going to look like when it's grown up, when it's achieved immortality. I just had no idea. And it just fascinated me how they did turn out, because you never could, you couldn't predict just by what the glaze looked like on before the firing.
Absolutely. And there's this wonderful friendship that Thomas shared with Samuel Bach. And Thomas felt that 2,000 years from now, Bach's work will still be an important statement of the human condition. And Sam Bach has always said that 2,000 years from now, Thomas's works will always endure as a statement of the human soul and the human spirit. So that combination of two wonderful men working alongside one another and yet recognizing the extended meaning of each of their creations was such a joy just to be part of. The next quote is, skill and art are not the same thing. The only real measure of art is astonishment. And I must say that that statement that Thomas uttered or wrote has really been a guiding light to me and to the gallery as to whether or not the work in a portfolio that someone shares with us provides a moment of astonishment, a kind of recognition that this is really wonderful. And it's something that we want to take our time and energy to invest in to share with others, so others can experience that same moment of wow, of astonishment, of amazement, that another human being has created something that resonates with me and then enables me to really be a better person because of it. And my guess is, Jeff, that one, your own creations, but also having Thomas as a colleague and encouraging you as a creative artist must have been part of that experience as well.
He had a wonderful mannerism when he was astonished, because I would see this. We listened to quite a bit of symphonic music together. And I introduced him to some of my favorites, things that might have been a little bit obscure, that he greatly enjoyed. The works of Paul Hindemith, Edouard Toubin. These weren't exactly household names. We had very similar taste in music. It's no surprise that his absolute favorite was Mozart, because of the association. It's so well understood how Mozart's associated with the divine, because that was the subject of the famous movie Amadeus, where the one of the figures of the protagonist literally goes mad because he just can't reconcile the idea that someone who was dissipated and debauched could actually be the voice of God in music. The only disagreement we had in music was he didn't like Brahms, which just, I never could understand that. And I reminded him, scolded him. I said, remember, Brahms' closest friend was a surgeon. And he even composed work for Theodor Billroth. And so Thomas gave him a little bit of a pass on that. But his reaction to music that moved him deeply, or writing that when we identify a piece of writing that we're both struck by, was sort of almost kind of a deep moan, like, Jeff, you'd be in that kind of a reaction of acknowledgement.
I love it. And the next three images we're going to look at really bring home to me how beautifully installed the show is, but also the resonance between the art of Paul Caponegro and this first negative print of his, then the Brother Thomas, which is an extraordinary piece on so many levels, but especially the upper level where it sort of bounces up to the opening with a wonderful medallion on it. And then it is juxtaposed with the Paul Caponegro of the frosted window in Ipswich. To have those three pieces, one next to the other, is for me this kind of ideal trio of major works of art, of masterworks actually, singing to one another in such a beautiful, beautiful way. And if there is a single regret I have about Thomas having checked out 11 years ago or more actually, 14, it is he wasn't here to see this, to really be uplifted by the relationship of beauty that is in his work and certainly in the work of Paul Caponegro. There isn't near it a plate we'll look at in a minute, but the quote I want to share is, when we abandon tradition and culture, there are no honest roots for creativity. And I think that in all areas, certainly in literature, in theology, in art, Thomas understood that we all have a past. It doesn't mean that the past needs to determine what we do, but it certainly can inform and inspire what we do. And Thomas's work as a ceramic artist with a 5,000-year history is a perfect example of his honoring the past and yet creating wonderful contemporary works. And the next piece, I think, says it all. It is one of the most beautiful pieces of dancing form that I've ever seen of Thomas's, and it's just here. It exists. I mean, it stuns me in a very wonderful way. And your thoughts, Jeff, about it? And
it's so Thomas, because, great art, big theme. To me, this is Thomas's way of describing the Big Bang. That's what I had always thought about this piece. The molten elements, the gold, the energy emanating from the center in a symmetrical fashion, in kind of an eternal fashion. And ultimately, like everything else, leads to awe and mystery. I think for him, one of the acid tests of great art is it leaving the person with a sense of awe, of open-endedness? Because it was that openness to the unknowable, openness to the things that we already do know, that was so appealing to his presence, whether it was with people, with ideas, with creative acts.
That's a beautiful way to describe why Thomas's presence continues for, I think, all of us, because we do aspire to that, to asking those questions that inform, engage, and uplift who we can be as human beings. And it's so wonderful that it's in the humblest of materials. It's in clay. So
He was very practical, though. That was why it was always such a delight to talk with him and be with him, because on the one hand, you could be in a celestial sort of frame of mind, but on the other hand, he was really organized. He really, was good at mathematics. He understood physics and chemistry, and I had no problem explaining those kinds of things. He actually, and I've used his exact words as a way of teaching surgical residents principles of trauma. Thomas said that first you do what's necessary, then you do what's possible, and pretty soon you're doing the impossible. That's a direct quote from Thomas. And that summarizes right there the principles of triage and management of patients or groups of patients in the same priorities. You put out the hottest fire first, which is usually related to human suffering. And before you know it, you really can talk realistically about extending life and bringing people back and that kind of thing.
It's wonderful to have your world and Thomas's world woven together in such a beautiful way. Clearly, the next quote says much about him, but I think teaches us as well. Forget what you give, but never forget what you are given. And I really believe that the Thomas Fellowships have grown out of exactly that. There were times along the way when he was both at the monastery in Weston and then also in Erie, where people extended themselves, not for gain for themselves, but simply because of who he was. And those moments where someone would front the money to get him a tank of propane gas so he could do a firing at the monastery. Or when John, our son, and I met him in Weston on the edge of him about leaving the community and said to him that we would send him money on a monthly basis just to help him. That I think out of that grew basically this vision of Brother Thomas Fellowships and the Brother Thomas Foundation to really help artists. And he was absolutely clear to help struggling artists. There was no age requirement, there was no geographic requirement, there was no medium requirement. It was struggling artists. And as a result, amongst the 75, 76 artists in Boston who received it, you have poets and dancers, you have musicians and hip hop people, you have a jeweler recently won it, in addition to ceramic artists. But the emphasis was not on the medium, it was on the need to give the artist an opportunity to turn a corner, to take a month for themselves, to finish paying the tuition of a son or daughter at college, so they didn't have to do 5 more gigs. And it really was exactly an extension of that quote. He never forgot what he was given. And now his legacy is to give and give and give to so many others.
This was an idea a long time coming from him. He discussed this a long time. He was very specific about how he'd been helped. And I don't ever remember a conversation where someone, he was grateful to somebody, whether it was, the Chinese restaurant owner bringing him soup every Tuesday when he was ill. That just meant so much to him.
Yeah.
The fact, it wasn't even whether he was able to take the soup or not, just the fact that the person did this. But he talked about it, and then he wrestled with the idea of what form should his legacy be. He wondered, should I preserve and share all my formulas, or should I just destroy them all? And I never really got a clear answer what their fate would be. I reassured him. I said, you could publish these things, you could put them online, and anyone could have them, but they're not going to be making Brother Thomas's stuff. It's too much of it is you.
That's so lovely. This is a wonderful example of Thomas's frugality. This is a very beautiful people with an extraordinary pattern on the inside, and people look inside and say, oh, that's amazing. How did he do it? And basically, if you remember when you used to buy rubbish bags, they came with wire wrapped in paper that you would then use as a tie for the rubbish bag. Well, they created a pattern if you impress them into the moist clay. And so the inside of this piece is simply an extension of that. Probably not the best segue, but nonetheless, one of my favorite quotes of Thomas is the next one. The routine of life holds us in readiness for events of the soul. And certainly that was so true of, I think, each one of us, as long as we were open and attuned to that. You mentioned before something about him being organized and orderly. Ritual was a very important part of his life, and ritual, when used as Thomas did, provides a structure, a framework, which we can hang our lives in and on. And in doing that, you also need the enhanced awareness that this quote refers to. It provides us with the readiness for those moments, those events of the soul, of the spirit, of our humanity, to somehow blossom and grow. And to have had that as a teaching in our lives produces the next piece we'll look at, but it produced this opportunity in so many ways to be enriched by one single other person. And I think that's a miracle.
I know he was very preoccupied with that particular glaze as dusk was coming in his life. And if you look closely, the tiniest little white dots suggest, the edges of the Milky Way. I always thought it was more than a coincidence that there was a sort of a celestial quality to these.
That's a lovely way to think about it, and you're right. So these are pieces that Thomas fired between December of 2006 and August of 2007 when he died. And so the night sky blue certainly speaks to that.
And there's another layer of meaning. I never really, didn't remember specifically talking to them, but he loved the Marian idea, the idea that there are intercessory figures in our life. There is the protective nature of the Virgin Mary. Blue is the color of the Virgin Mary. And here, living on Lake Erie, we're all familiar with Stella Maris. The star of the sea is the North Star. That's the star that saves lives by guiding ships at night. These are all ideas that would have appealed to him deeply in his own tradition. So I think it's more than chance that this was something that did appear during that time in his life.
It's quite beautiful. Certainly, Thomas, in his writings, but also in his practice as an artist, believed very strongly in risking and dreaming, our primary acts of creativity. And I think more than anything else about the young social entrepreneurs that we are now dealing with in Boston, and I'm sure across the country, who really take this to heart, that they are risking in many instances livelihood, their own next opportunity to create a better world, and they're dreaming about it, and then they are acting upon it. We're hosting in this coming few months a number of these organizations in Boston that are there to make this a safer, better, healthier universe for everyone. And whenever I'm asked to introduce them, I frequently use this quote. This encourages the best in us. And Thomas was always there for us in that way. The next image certainly speaks to that which is risk and beautiful and creative and dreamlike. These floating clouds over this very beautiful statuesque form, just, almost beyond words.
That's one he would have, I'll bet he put a star by that one.
I should really go back and check. That's a nice thought for sure.
No, I just kind of have a feeling he himself will, wow.
That's a pretty good one. He, in the most recent book, of course, that we put together, the day book called Revelations, one of my favorite quotes in that book is the next to last one we're going to look at, which is consciousness of the beautiful will save the world. And I think rarely do any of us think about that notion. It's not only the creation of beauty, it's the awareness of it, the consciousness of it, that creates the energy that potentially could save this world, which certainly needs saving at this point. Jeff, any thoughts?
Well, I think sort of the absence of beauty was kind of a red flag in his framework, his cosmology. The absence of true beauty is an absence of God.
And I think that it's important and to recognize that in his universe, it was a God that was important to him, but never a God that he imposed on anyone else.
Oh, no, not at all.
It was a very generous kind of.
He was so respectful and open and interested and engaged in so many traditions. We spoke about this at length. I was a religion major in college. So we talked about on a sort of a scholarly level, but also on a more personal level that, he was not an overtly or demonstrably religious person, but religion was extremely important to him. But it never blinded him to its importance in its own way to any other person he was with.
It was so wonderful. I sent him a number of Jewish prayer books, and frequently he would then highlight something in the prayer book or in a prayer service that suddenly resonated where he was at in his own journey. And it was so wonderful because then he enabled me to better understand and appreciate that particular passage, that there was a kind of generosity of spirit that was Thomas's that came through in our correspondence, obviously, but more than that, in the way that he ministered, and I use that word thoughtfully because his ministry was his correspondence for the most part. You were one of the few people and the nuns in the community who were in touch with him on a daily basis. But most of the people that he was in touch with across the world were part of his ministry. They were part of the shared journey toward that which is beautiful. I think we're close to the last image, Rose, which is from the documentary done in 1991. I will only begin it and end it with the most recent phrase on the wall in the gallery, which is from Thomas: "Love is real and the rest is not." And also thank you, Jeff, for being part of this as we listen to Thomas giving us guidance again.
Well, sometimes I say I'm not really doing art, I'm doing theology, but it's a statement of hope that that's what I'm doing, that I am communicating those things that speak of God. In philosophy, they speak of accidents, those signs of the reality that we encounter first. And one word for them is the transcendentals. It's a polysyllabic word that scares people off, but it's one of the most concrete. It points to one of the most concrete experiences that we have as human beings. And it points to what is beautiful, what is good, what is true, and what unites and does not divide. It is just in being faithful to the work that the work is born. It's not in setting goals, external goals, but in trying to measure up to the interior goals. That constitutes the real process of art. I had this dream of a absolutely perfect pot. It was very simple shape, pure white. It was so simple, so pure that it was almost not there. And for years I pursued that. During my tiger years, I had all that energy. I pursued it and pursued it till finally the dream faded and the effort to try to reproduce it disappeared also. then when I was in Japan, I realized after the experiences that I had in Japan that that white pot was myself. And then I realized that it was myself that I was trying to make pure, better, more beautiful person, a more truthful person, a person concerned with uniting and not dividing what he encounters and meets along the journey in this world. So it is a metaphor for me, for myself.